Today, we're going over one of the most insane rags to riches stories in history. A story of a man who went from herding pigs in a forgotten village to sitting on the throne of the Roman Empire. And oh, by the way, he couldn't even read. Justin I. It's around the year 470 AD, and in a tiny hamlet called Beteriana, somewhere in the mountains of what is now Serbia, a teenage boy named Justin is doing what he does every single day. He's herding pigs. The same muddy paths, the same crushing poverty that his father knew and his father's father before him. Life in Dardania was brutal. The region had been ravaged by wave after wave of barbarian invasions. First, the Huns came through and burned everything. Then the Ostrogoths showed up and took whatever was left. The Roman Empire that was supposed to protect them, it had basically forgotten this corner of the world even existed. Justin looks around at the barren hills and the starving villagers, and he makes a decision that will change the course of human history. He's not going to die here. He's not going to spend his entire life ankle-deep in pig shit, waiting for the next group of barbarians to come through and kill everyone he knows. He's going to Constantinople. Now, if you don't know much about Constantinople in the 5th century, let me paint you a picture. This wasn't just any city. This was the city. The largest, richest, most magnificent city in the entire world. We're talking massive walls that had never been breached, golden dome churches, palaces that made everything in Western Europe look like a peasant's hut, and a population of over 500,000 people. Rome had fallen. The Western Empire was gone. But Constantinople was thriving. And Justin, this illiterate pig farmer from the middle of nowhere, decided that's where he was going to make his fortune. So one morning, Justin and two of his childhood friends, Zamarcus and Didavistus, probably names you've never heard and will never hear again because they disappear from history after this, pack up everything they own. And when I say everything they own, I mean the ragged clothes on their backs and a single sack of bread to share between the three of them. That's it. That's all they had. And they start walking. Constantinople was hundreds of miles away. Hundreds of miles. Through mountains, through territories controlled by various barbarian tribes, through lands where bandits would kill you for a pair of shoes. And these three farm boys just started walking with nothing but some stale bread. We don't know exactly how long the journey took. We don't know what they encountered along the way. All we know is that somehow, against all odds, they made it. Three peasants with nothing to their names arrived at the gates of the greatest city on earth. And here's where Justin's story takes its first turn. See, when Justin arrived in Constantinople around the year 470, he had absolutely no connections, no money, no education, and no prospects. But he did have one thing going for him. He was young, he was strong, and he was willing to fight. At exactly this moment in history, the Emperor Leo I was creating a brand new military unit called the Excubitors. This was going to be an elite palace guard, 300 of the best soldiers in the empire, whose job was to protect the emperor himself. And here's the crucial detail. Leo specifically wanted to fill this unit with men who weren't German. See, at this point, the Roman military was absolutely crawling with Germanic mercenaries, and Leo didn't trust them. He wanted loyal Romans, preferably big, strong Romans from the provinces, who had no political connections and would be personally loyal to him. Justin and his two friends showed up at exactly the right time. They were Latin-speaking, they were from Roman territory, they were built like oxen from years of physical labor, and they had absolutely nothing to lose. All three of them were accepted into the Excubitors. Now, what happened to Zamarcus and Didavistus? Nobody knows. They vanished from history completely. Maybe they died in some skirmish. Maybe they just lived out quiet lives as regular soldiers. But Justin was different. From the moment he put on that uniform, something clicked. This man who couldn't read a single word, who had spent his childhood herding pigs, turned out to be an absolutely exceptional soldier. He fought in the Isaurian Wars, brutal campaigns against mountain tribes in what is now southern Turkey. He fought against the Sassanid Persians, the only empire in the world that could rival Rome. And every single time, he distinguished himself through raw courage and tactical instinct. His superiors noticed. The Isaurian campaigns were brutal. These weren't battles against some organized army that would meet you on an open field. This was mountain warfare against people who knew every cave, every cliff, every ambush point. The Isaurians had been raiding Roman territory for centuries, and they weren't about to stop just because some emperor told them to. Justin, the former pig farmer, turned out to be exactly the kind of soldier you wanted in that environment. He understood hardship. He understood survival. He understood that sometimes you had to be more brutal than your enemy just to stay alive. The Persian campaigns were different. The Sassanid Empire was the only real peer competitor Rome had. They had cavalry that could rival the best Roman troops. They had engineers who could build siege weapons just as sophisticated as anything Constantinople could produce. Fighting Persia wasn't like crushing some mountain bandits. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing an equally powerful reflection staring back. Justin fought in both kinds of war, and he survived both. More than survived. He thrived. Year after year, promotion after promotion, Justin climbed the ranks. Tribune, comes, senator. Each step up the ladder, each new title, brought him closer to power. And the whole time, he still couldn't read. But here's the thing about Justin that people consistently underestimated. He wasn't stupid. He was uneducated. There's a massive difference. This was a man who had survived a journey of hundreds of miles with nothing but bread. A man who had risen through the ranks of the most competitive military organization in the world. He couldn't read the reports his subordinates gave him, but he could read people, and he could read situations. By the time the Emperor Anastasius I took the throne in 491, Justin had become one of the most powerful men in Constantinople. He was now the Comes Excubitorum, the commander of the palace guard. This meant he controlled the only soldiers inside the capital city. He had the emperor's ear. He walked the halls of the great palace as if he belonged there. And the pig farmer from Betteriana still couldn't write his own name. Sources tell us that Justin had to use a special wooden stencil with the letters Legi carved into it just to sign official documents. He would trace the letters like a child learning to write. Some historians think this might be exaggerated or even made up by his enemies. But even if it's only partially true, think about what that means. Here's a man commanding armies, advising emperors, making decisions that affected millions of lives, and he needed a wooden template to sign his own name. But Justin was smart enough to know his limitations. And he was smart enough to know that what he lacked, others could provide. Enter Justinian. Justin had never forgotten his family back in Betteriana. Unlike most men who escaped poverty, he didn't abandon his relatives. His sister Vigilantia had a son, a brilliant young man named Petrus Sabatius. And Justin, who had no children of his own, saw something in this nephew. Something special. He brought young Petrus to Constantinople. He paid for the finest education money could buy. The best tutors, the best schools, access to the greatest libraries in the world. Everything that Justin himself never had, he gave to his nephew. And Petrus, in gratitude for this gift, took a new name to honor his uncle, Justinianus. Justinian. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because this nephew would one day become Justinian the Great, arguably the most famous Byzantine emperor in history, the man who would build the Hagia Sophia, reconquer half the Western Roman Empire, and create a legal code that still influences laws today. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, it's the year 518, and Emperor Anastasius I has just died in the middle of the night during a violent thunderstorm. He was somewhere between 88 and 90 years old, and he died without naming an heir. The empire was thrown into chaos. Anastasius had 3 nephews, and any of them could make a claim to the throne. But there was also a eunuch named Amantius, the Propositus Sacri Cubiculi, basically the head of the imperial household, who had his own candidate. Amantius wanted to put a man named Theocritus on the throne. Why? Because Theocritus was his puppet. If Theocritus became emperor, Amantius would be the real power behind the throne. And here's where Amantius made what would turn out to be a fatal mistake. He knew that whoever controlled the palace guards controlled the outcome of any succession crisis. And who commanded the palace guards? Justin. So Amantius gave Justin a massive sum of money and told him to bribe the excubitors to support Theocritus. Justin took the money. And then, in a move that was either brilliantly calculated or simply opportunistic, he used that money to bribe the soldiers to support himself. On the morning of July 9th, 518, the high officials of the empire gathered in the Great Palace to choose a new emperor. Outside, in the Hippodrome, tens of thousands of citizens waited anxiously to learn who would rule them. Several names were put forward. The crowd rejected them one by one. Fights broke out. People were getting nervous that civil war might erupt. And then someone suggested Justin. The executors, paid off with Amantius's own money, began chanting his name. The crowd in the Hippodrome picked up the chant. The Senate, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly agreed. And just like that, a 68-year-old former swineherd who couldn't read his own name was proclaimed Emperor of the Roman Empire. The coronation took place in the Hippodrome, with the Patriarch of Constantinople placing the crown on Justin's head. Tens of thousands of citizens cheered. The man who had walked into this city with nothing but bread was now dressed in purple, wearing the imperial diadem, receiving the acclamations of a crowd that would have ignored him completely just 50 years earlier. What must that have felt like? Think about it. Justin remembered herding pigs. He remembered hunger. He remembered watching barbarians burn villages and kill his neighbors. He remembered that long, desperate walk through hostile territory with his two friends and a bag of stale bread. And now, he was Emperor of Rome. The first thing he did after the coronation was distribute money to the troops and the people, 5 gold coins and a pound of silver to every soldier, gifts to the citizens. This was standard practice for new emperors. But for Justin, it must have had a different meaning. He remembered what it was like to have nothing. He knew exactly what those coins would mean to someone struggling to survive. Let that sink in for a moment. In a world where birth and bloodline meant everything, where aristocrats spent their entire lives scheming for power, a peasant from a destroyed village in the mountains had just become the most powerful man in the known world. Justin's first order of business was cleaning house. Remember Amantius, the guy who gave Justin the bribe money? 9 days after Justin took the throne, Amantius was dead. Officially, he was executed for being a Manichaean heretic. In reality, everyone knew it was because he had tried to put someone else on the throne. Theocritus, the puppet emperor who never was, also executed. Several other potential rivals were either killed or exiled. The pig farmer from Betteriana was playing imperial politics now. But Justin wasn't just surviving, he was actively shaping the empire. And here's where his reign gets genuinely interesting from a historical perspective. You see, the previous emperor, Anastasius, had been a Miaphysite. This was a branch of Christianity that believed Christ had only one nature, divine and human combined. This put him at odds with the Pope in Rome and with a significant portion of his own population who followed Chalcedonian Christianity, which held that Christ had two separate natures. This religious dispute had caused a schism between Rome and Constantinople that had lasted for over 30 years. The Acacian Schism, as it was called, had cut the Christian world in half. Justin, the illiterate soldier, decided to end it. Within months of taking the throne, he had negotiated a reconciliation with Pope Hormisdas. The schism was healed. East and West were united in faith again. For the first time in decades, a Byzantine emperor was actually popular with the Pope. Not bad for a guy who couldn't read the Bible. But Justin faced challenges too. There was a general named Vitalian who had nearly overthrown the previous emperor. Vitalian was popular, powerful, and had an army loyal to him. He was also a staunch Chalcedonian Christian, which had made him an enemy of Anastasius, but should have made him a friend of Justin. Justin, showing remarkable political instincts for an unlettered peasant, invited Vitalian to Constantinople. He showered him with honors, made him a consul, gave him command of important military units, basically brought his most dangerous potential rival inside the tent rather than leaving him outside causing trouble. And then, in 520, Vitalian was stabbed to death at a royal banquet, 17 wounds, right there in the palace. Who ordered it? The sources are cagey, but they strongly suggest it was Justinian, Justin's nephew and now heir apparent. With Vitalian dead, there was no one left who could challenge Justinian's eventual succession to the throne. The dynasty was secure. But here's the thing about Justin's reign that often gets overlooked. Yes, he relied heavily on Justinian for the intellectual work of governing. Yes, he needed help reading documents and understanding complex legal matters. But the big picture decisions, those were his. It was Justin who decided to heal the religious schism with Rome. Justin, who chose to reconcile with Vitalian rather than fight him. Justin, who navigated the complicated relationship with Theodoric and the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. Justin, who managed relations with the Sassanid Persian Empire, including nearly adopting the Persian Prince Khosrow, which would have been one of the most bizarre diplomatic moves in history if it had gone through. The illiterate pig farmer had better instincts than most emperors who had been trained for the job since birth. As Justin entered his 70s, his health began to decline. He was suffering from some kind of illness, possibly an old wound that never healed properly, possibly something like diabetes. His mind was reportedly slipping too. Some sources suggest he was becoming senile, though others argue this was propaganda spread by enemies of his dynasty. What's certain is that Justin knew he was dying, and he made sure that everything was in place for Justinian to succeed him. In 525, Justin changed the law to allow senators to marry actresses and other women of low social standing. This wasn't some abstract legal reform. This was specifically designed to allow Justinian to marry Theodora, a former actress and, if the scandalous histories are to be believed, a former prostitute. Theodora would go on to become one of the most powerful empresses in Byzantine history, a woman who quite possibly saved the empire during the Nika riots when her husband was ready to flee. But that's another story. On April 1st, 527, Justin formally named Justinian as his co-emperor. 4 months later, on August 1st, Justin died. The pig farmer from Betteriana was gone. But here's the thing, without Justin, there is no Justinian. Without that illiterate peasant who walked hundreds of miles with nothing but a sack of bread, there is no Hagia Sophia, no Corpus Juris Civilis, no reconquest of North Africa and Italy, no Justinian dynasty. Everything that Justinian accomplished, and he accomplished more than almost any other ruler in European history, was built on the foundation his uncle created. Justin didn't just survive his journey from poverty to power, he created a dynasty that would rule the Byzantine Empire for nearly a century and fundamentally reshape the Mediterranean world. When Justin arrived in Constantinople as a young man, he owned nothing but the rags on his back. When he died, he was Emperor of Rome, ruler of the greatest empire on earth, and the founder of a dynasty that would be remembered for over 1,000 years. And he still couldn't read his own obituary. But wait, there's one more thing I need to tell you about, because what happened after Justin died might be the most incredible part of this whole story. See, Justin didn't just pass the crown to Justinian, he passed him an empire that was ready to explode. Within 5 years of taking the throne, Justinian faced the Nika riots. 30,000 people died in the streets of Constantinople. The city was burning. The mob was literally outside the palace gates, ready to tear Justinian apart. At one point, Justinian was so terrified that he was preparing to flee the city by ship. And you know who convinced him to stay? Theodora, the former actress that Justin's law change had allowed Justinian to marry. She stood before the emperor and his advisors and delivered one of the most famous speeches in Byzantine history. "Purple makes a fine shroud," she reportedly said, meaning, if we're going to die, let's die as emperors, not as cowards. Justinian stayed. He sent his general Belisarius to crush the rioters, and when the blood was washed from the hippodrome, somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 people were dead. But the empire survived, and from the ashes of that destruction, Justinian built the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. A building so magnificent that when Justinian first entered it upon completion, he reportedly whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." He built it with money his uncle had carefully accumulated, with stability his uncle had established, with the legal and religious framework his uncle had created. The illiterate pig farmer never saw the Hagia Sophia. He never saw Belisarius reconquer North Africa from the Vandals or retake Italy from the Goths. He never saw the Justinian Code compiled, a legal document that would influence every legal system in the Western world for the next 1,500 years. But none of it would have happened without him. When historians talk about the greatest Byzantine emperors, they talk about Constantine, who founded the city. They talk about Justinian, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent since the fall of Rome. They talk about Basil II and Heraclius and a dozen others. They rarely talk about Justin. And maybe that's okay, because Justin's achievement wasn't building churches or conquering territories. Justin's achievement was surviving. It was walking into Constantinople with nothing and walking out as emperor. It was founding a dynasty that would reshape the world. It was proving that the impossible was possible. Sometimes people ask what the lesson of history is, what we're supposed to learn from these old stories, and usually, I think that's the wrong question. History doesn't exist to teach us lessons. History exists because it happened. But if there is something to take from Justin's story, maybe it's this. The world tells you that birth determines destiny, that where you come from defines where you can go, that there are limits to what certain people can achieve, and sometimes, maybe most of the time, that's true, but every once in a while, some illiterate pig farmer from a village nobody's ever heard of walks into the greatest city on earth with nothing but a bag of bread and becomes emperor of the known world. History is weird like that. Oh, and one more thing. Remember those two friends who walked with Justin all the way from Beteriana to Constantinople? Zamarcus and Didavistus, the ones who completely vanished from history? I like to think they lived long, quiet lives. Maybe they became minor officers in the military, or settled down and started families. Maybe they were at Justin's coronation, standing somewhere in the crowd, thinking about that day decades earlier when three hungry peasants set out on a journey that seemed absolutely insane. We'll never know. History only remembers the ones who make it to the top. But those two friends, they made the same walk, took the same risks, had the same courage. They just weren't quite as lucky. Or maybe they were the lucky ones. Because being emperor isn't all it's cracked up to be. Just ask Justin's nephew, who spent his entire reign fighting wars, crushing rebellions, and watching a plague kill a third of his population. But hey, at least he could read.